On September 27, 1981, one of the most disturbing cases of family isolation and inbreeding ever recorded in the United States came to light in Osle County, Kentucky. Nestled deep within the Appalachian Mountains, Osle was already recognized as one of America's poorest counties. For generations, families had lived in secluded valleys, cut off from the outside world by formidable mountains and roads that became utterly impassable during brutal winters. It was on that day, beneath a light drizzle that wrapped the mountains in a veil of mist, that a state social services team, while performing routine checks on unregistered properties, stumbled upon a dilapidated house in an area called La Rose. The property sat nearly 5 miles from the main road, reachable only by a dirt track that twisted through pine trees and ancient oaks. What they uncovered would forever alter the quiet history of that valley. The house, a wooden structure darkened by age, lacked any real windows. Its openings were covered with scraps of plastic and cardboard. The roof had clear gaps, and the land around it was choked with tall weeds and rusting debris. The first thing that struck the social workers was an unusual silence. Even in the most remote homes, there were always sounds: chickens clucking, an old radio playing, voices murmuring. Here, the quiet itself seemed to have a presence. Knocking on the door, they were met by a woman who looked elderly, later identified as 72-year-old Martha Bram. She attempted to block the assistants from entering, but the strong smell coming from within, along with the elderly woman's clearly frail state, warranted an immediate entry. Inside that house, which had no electricity or running water, lived 6 individuals: Martha, her daughter Eloise Bram, 49, and 4 younger women, who were later identified as Eloise's daughters. These 4 women, ranging in age from approximately 18 to 30, exhibited alarming physical traits: asymmetrical faces, severe strabismus, prominent jaws, and most notably, an obvious difficulty with communication. None could speak clearly, producing only guttural sounds and rudimentary phrases that seemed comprehensible only to themselves. Even the most seasoned social workers were shocked by the scene. Official reports described how the women moved through the space like apparitions, seemingly unaware of our presence. Their movements were uncoordinated, and all displayed repetitive behaviors, such as constantly rocking back and forth. What was most disturbing was the complete absence of any records. None of the 4 women possessed a birth certificate, school record, or any official document. It was as if, beyond those walls, they simply did not exist. This case was merely the start of uncovering a history of inbreeding that had stretched across decades, an invisible cycle of seclusion, abuse, and neglect that created one of the starkest examples of the devastating consequences of sustained familial interbreeding. As officials struggled to comprehend what they were witnessing, the 4 sisters, who would later receive the names Agnes, Mary, Louise, and Catherine, as they had no official identities, remained seated on the dirt floor, as if this interruption in their routine was just a minor disturbance in decades of silence. However, the true story of these women had begun much earlier, in a different era of Kentucky, where geographic and cultural seclusion created the ideal conditions for a family to turn inward across generations. To follow more cases like this, which unsettle entire communities and expose concealed realities, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any investigation. Following the initial discovery, county authorities confronted an unprecedented task: how to investigate a situation with virtually no records, outside witnesses, or formal documentation. The 4 women were promptly taken to Cumberland Valley Regional Hospital for medical assessment, while Eloise and Martha were held in custody. Initial medical reports from September 30, 1981, disclosed a disturbing condition. The 4 sisters displayed a range of physical and cognitive traits that doctors at the time attributed to what they termed degeneration by inbreeding. Dr. Robert Harkins, who led the medical team, remarked in his confidential report, "We are dealing with a case where family endogamy appears to have persisted over multiple generations, resulting in classic expressions of accumulated recessive disorders." Investigating the family history faced major hurdles immediately. Martha Bram refused to cooperate, insisting that family matters were no one's concern. The limited information she gave was contradictory and unclear. Eloise, for her part, had limited cognitive abilities and showed unmistakable indications of profound psychological trauma. Through parish records from the local Baptist church and accounts from distant neighbors, investigators began assembling the complex puzzle of the Bram lineage. Initial clues pointed to a narrative starting in the 1920s, when William Bram, Eloise's father, settled in that remote area after leaving a mining community in Harlan County. A key testimony came from Joseph Miller, then 83, who had lived roughly 2 miles from the Bram property since 1925. According to his account to social worker Margaret Thompson on October 5, 1981, William was a peculiar man who kept everyone away from his land. He married a second cousin, Sally, who already had trouble speaking properly. After she died in childbirth with one of the children around 1940, we never saw an adult woman in that house again, only little Eloise growing up. The other children, 2 boys, also never left. Another critical piece came from Florence Watson, a midwife who had served the region since the 1930s. In her statement on October 12, 1981, she disclosed, "I was summoned to the Bram property in 1945 to assist with a young woman's delivery. When I arrived, I realized it was Eloise, only 13 years old, pregnant and in labor. William wouldn't let me remain after the baby was born, a boy. I tried to alert the sheriff then, but no one wanted to get involved with the Brams." The investigation then focused on reconstructing the birth chronology at the property. Between 1945 and 1963, Eloise apparently gave birth to 6 children, including the 4 women found in 1981. No formal records existed for any of these births, and the lack of genetic testing at that time made it impossible to definitively establish each child's paternity. Still, the clinical assessments and gathered testimonies indicated a troubling scenario. William Bram had not only abused his own daughter Eloise, but his sons, Eloise's brothers, seemed to perpetuate the incestuous pattern after his death in 1967, resulting in the 4 women's births. A misleading theory emerged when investigators speculated about the women belonging to an isolationist religious group, a notion quickly dismissed after consulting experts on regional religious sections. Another line of inquiry considered possible ties to families making moonshine, the illicit liquor common in the area during and after Prohibition, but that also yielded no concrete proof. A major obstacle in the investigation came with Martha Bram's sudden death on October 29, 1981, just 1 month after the case came to light. The elderly woman passed away at the county hospital from complications of pneumonia and malnutrition, taking many of the answers investigators sought with her. By November 1981, the official inquiry had formed a prevailing theory. William Bram started a cycle of incestuous abuse with his daughter Eloise in the 1940s, leading to children who then continued the consanguineous cycle with their own mother and among themselves. The 4 women found in 1981 were the outcome of this intricate genetic entanglement, being at once daughters, sisters, and cousins in a family tree that folded back on itself. The Osceola County Prosecutor's Office faced an unparalleled legal dilemma: how to proceed when the main witnesses and potential defendants either had severe cognitive impairments or were already deceased. Furthermore, the statute of limitations for many offenses had expired, given that the initial abuses dated to the 1940s. In an internal memo from December 14, 1981, District Attorney Clarence Hammond wrote, "This case represents not just an unprecedented legal challenge but also a systemic failure of our social and community institutions. While we try to hold accountable any still living perpetrators, we must acknowledge that society as a whole has failed these women for decades." As the investigation moved into 1982, significant discoveries began surfacing from the Bram family's silent past. In January, researchers from the University of Kentucky were brought in to evaluate the case from a broader medical and anthropological perspective. The team, led by Dr. Helen Montgomery, a specialist in population genetics, reviewed medical records and conducted extensive interviews with longtime area residents. One of the most telling documents emerged from the local church archives, a baptismal record book containing notes from Pastor Jonathan Williams dated 1935, where he expressed concern about the improper marriage between William Bram and his cousin Sally. The pastor wrote, "I visited the Bram family today and found a concerning situation. William and Sally share maternal grandparents, and signs that our ancestors would associate with too much mixed blood are already noticeable in the children." In March 1982, the investigation uncovered a diary belonging to midwife Florence Watson, who had died in 1979. Amid the yellowed pages were detailed accounts of the births she attended at the Bram property between 1945 and 1963. In a particularly disturbing entry from August 1951, she wrote, I was called again to the Bram house. Little Eloise, now 19 years old, gave birth to her third child. The child presents the same distant eyes as the others. No one besides William and his sons lives on that property. May God have mercy on those children. Florence's diary documented 6 births from Eloise in 1945, 1947, 1951, 1954, 1958, and 1963. The 4 women discovered in 1981 corresponded to the births of 1951, Agnes, 1954, Mary, 1958, Louise, and 1963, Catherine. There was no mention of the first 2 children in more recent records. A particularly striking revelation came when the medical team conducted cranial radiographs and detailed physical exams of the 4 sisters. Dr. Samuel Pierce, a genetic disorder specialist from the University Hospital, observed that the patterns of bone, facial, and neurological abnormalities in the 4 women were consistent with the accumulation of deleterious recessive genes through multiple generations of inbreeding. Especially notable were the symmetrical craniofacial malformations present in all of them, suggesting a very close common ancestor. In April 1982, an accidental discovery shed new light on the case. While repairing a secondary road near the Bram property, workers uncovered bone remains buried in marshy ground. Forensic analysis, completed in June 1982, identified the remains as belonging to 2 children, approximately 2 and 5 years old, who had been buried at least 30 years prior. Although it was impossible to definitively identify the children without genetic tests, which would only become available years later, the location and timing aligned with Eloise's first 2 children, who were never located. Perhaps the most disturbing revelation came through a delayed testimony from Harriet Comolms, a social worker who had briefly visited the property in 1967 after receiving an anonymous complaint. In her statement in July 1982, she recounted, "I arrived at the property and was greeted by Martha, who prevented me from entering. I could briefly see the interior through the half-open door. I saw several people sitting on the floor, including young women and at least 2 adult men. What struck me was that they all rocked back and forth in the same rhythm, as if in a trance. Martha said they were just praying their way and that I should respect their religious beliefs." Comolms admitted that she did not press the inspection and did not formally record the incident due to pressure from the local community to not interfere in mountain matters. Her delayed testimony illustrated how cultural isolation and institutional neglect had allowed the abuse cycle to persist for decades. In August 1982, investigators located a former postal worker who had delivered mail in the region between 1960 and 1975. He reported that William Bram regularly received correspondence from a state institution in Frankfurt, likely related to social or agricultural benefits. This indicated that, despite their isolation, the family maintained minimal contact with government institutions, which nevertheless never conducted follow-up visits. A crucial piece of evidence surfaced in September 1982 when Dr. Montgomery's team analyzed old community photographs and identified Eloise in a school photo from 1940, her only appearance in official records. The 8-year-old girl already showed subtle physical signs consistent with first-degree consanguinity, suggesting the incestuous cycle may have started even before her, possibly with her own parents. Throughout these investigative months, the 4 sisters remained in a state institution for people with cognitive disabilities, where they received proper medical care and basic education for the first time. The institution's reports indicated modest but meaningful progress. After 6 months, Agnes and Mary could communicate with simple phrases and learned basic self-care tasks. Louise and Catherine, the youngest, demonstrated greater adaptability and learning capacity. Leave in the comments, never give up on the truth if you believe all missing persons deserve to be found. By late 1982, after over a year of intensive investigation, Kentucky authorities had finally pieced together what became known as the Bram case, one of the most extreme examples of family isolation and sustained inbreeding documented in the United States. The story that unfolded was more intricate and disturbing than initial assumptions. William Bram, born in 1902, grew up in an isolated Appalachian mining community where cousin marriages were relatively common due to geographic and cultural seclusion. In 1920, he married his second cousin, Sally Jenkins, with whom he had 3 children, Eloise, born in 1932, and 2 boys, Jacob in 1934 and Caleb in 1936. After Sally's death during the birth of a fourth stillborn child in 1938, William isolated the family further, moving to a remote property in Osley County. There, as investigators determined, he initiated a cycle of incestuous abuse with his daughter Eloise, leading to her first child's birth in 1945 when she was only 13. From there, the horror multiplied. Both William and his sons Jacob and Caleb maintained incestuous relationships with Eloise, creating a complex genetic web where the subsequent children were simultaneously siblings, half-siblings, and cousins. Martha, William's mother-in-law, and Sally's mother, remained on the property throughout, seemingly accepting or unable to prevent what was happening. The final legal documents compiled in December 1982 established the following timeline and genealogy. 1945, birth of Eloise's first child, paternity attributed to William, her own father. This child, a boy, died at age 2 and was buried on the property. 1947, birth of the second child, uncertain paternity between William and Jacob, father or brother of Eloise. This child also died in early childhood. 1951, birth of Agnes, paternity attributed to Caleb, Eloise's brother. 1954, birth of Mary, paternity attributed to Jacob, Eloise's brother. 1958, birth of Louise, paternity possibly attributed to the son born in 1945, Eloise's son and brother before his death. 1963, birth of Catherine, paternity attributed to William, shortly before his death. The genetic implications were profound. Dr. Samuel Pierce explained in his final report, this case represents an extreme example of multigenerational consanguinity where the coefficient of inbreeding reached levels rarely documented in modern medical literature. The phenotypic manifestations observed in the 4 surviving women are consistent with the homozygotic expression of multiple deleterious recessive genes. In medical terms, the 4 sisters presented a constellation of rare genetic conditions including moderate microcephaly, characteristic craniofacial deformities, moderate to severe intellectual disability, skeletal anomalies particularly in the extremities, congenital heart problems in 3 of them, partial hearing loss, and neurological disorders manifested as repetitive movements and communication difficulties. The legal resolution of the case was complicated by several factors. William Bram had died in 1967. Jacob and Caleb, who would have been between 46 and 48 in 1982, were never located. Investigators suspected they had also died or left the region years before. Eloise, at 50 in 1982, was assessed as severely cognitively compromised and unable to legally answer for her actions. On February 14, 1983, Judge Howard Thornton issued his final decision. Eloise Bram was declared legally incapable and sent to a state institution for long-term care. No formal criminal charges were filed due to the main perpetrator's deaths and Eloise's mental state. The 4 sisters, Agnes, Mary, Louise, and Catherine, became wards of the state of Kentucky, remaining in specialized institutions. The case's impact on the local community and state institutions was profound. In March 1983, the Kentucky Department of Social Services implemented a new protocol for regular visits to isolated properties, especially in mountainous regions with a history of cultural seclusion. State legislation was revised to strengthen child protection mechanisms and abuse prevention. For the small community of Osley County, the case represented a turning point. The silence that had allowed horror to persist for decades was finally broken. In an April 1983 editorial in the local Osley County News, the editor wrote, "For too long, we have hidden our eyes behind the notion of family privacy and mountain autonomy. The Bram case teaches us a painful lesson about the price of silence and collective indifference." Subsequent developments revealed more about the lasting impact of extreme inbreeding. Throughout the 1980s, the 4 sisters received medical treatments and special education they had never accessed before. The institution's reports documented slow but significant progress. Agnes, the oldest, never developed complete speech but learned basic sign communication and could perform simple tasks with supervision. She died in 1997 from cardiac complications at age 46. Mary demonstrated greater adaptability, learning to read simple words and developing notable artistic abilities. Her drawings, often depicting 4 female figures holding hands, were preserved by the institution. She died in 2001 at age 47 from a respiratory infection. Louise, considered the most resilient of the four, eventually managed to work on supervised tasks in the institution's laundry and developed basic social relationships with staff and other residents. She died in 2008 at age 50. Catherine, the youngest, showed the most significant cognitive gains after receiving adequate stimulation. In 1990, she was transferred to a supervised residential group environment where she lived until her death in 2012 at age 49. The old Bram property, site of decades of horror, was eventually seized by the state for unpaid taxes. In 1990, the deteriorated structure was demolished, and the area gradually returned to nature. Today, few local residents can identify the exact spot where the house once stood. In 2002, a discrete memorial was established in the county cemetery dedicated to the Bram sisters and all silent victims of isolation and neglect. The plaque bears only 4 names: Agnes, Mary, Louise, and Catherine, without dates or additional details, a silent testament to lives that nearly went unnoticed by society. The Bram case's legacy endures as a somber reminder of the dangers of extreme isolation and institutional neglect. The story of the 4 Kentucky sisters has become a case study in social service and medical colleges, illustrating the devastating effects of sustained inbreeding and the critical importance of social protection systems. In a retrospective report published in 2010 by the Kentucky Department of Health and Human Services, the commissioner wrote, "The Bram case represents a systemic failure that transcends specific individuals or departments. It was a failure of an entire society to recognize and protect its most vulnerable members. The lessons learned continue to shape our policies and practices to this day." Beyond the medical and legal aspects, the case raises profound questions about community, collective responsibility, and the complicit silence that sometimes allows horror to flourish in the shadows. As Dr. Helen Montgomery observed in her final report on the case, the tragedy of the Bram sisters was not just the result of horrible acts committed by individuals, but also of countless acts of omission by neighbors, officials, and institutions that preferred not to see what was before their eyes. Today, the case remains one of the most extreme examples of inbreeding documented in American medical history, not only for the degree of genetic proximity involved but for the duration of the incestuous cycle over multiple generations. The physical and cognitive characteristics of the 4 sisters offered researchers rare insights into the cumulative effects of severe endogamy in humans. The most inbred women of Kentucky, as they became known, never knew about the impact their existences would have on medicine, child protection legislation, and public awareness. They lived and died in a limited world, first within the walls of a windowless house, then within the gentler walls of the institutions that finally offered them care. If you've watched this far, it means you care about these cases that mark families forever. Leave a comment saying, "I watched this far so I can get to know you and know who really cares about the search for truth." Don't forget to like this video and share it with those who are also interested in real cases that make us reflect on the limits of the human condition.